What is the most violent era in human history? For many people, the answer lies between 770 and 221 BCE in ancient China, an era known as the Warring States period. This was an era that spanned 500 years of pure and utter carnage. Kingdoms wouldn't even last a decade before being brought to the ground and conquered, with entire societies and cultures made just for war. Some of the largest mass executions in recorded history took place during this time period, and the amount of deaths was so high that some claimed it changed the very color of the earth itself. And over the course of these 500 years, what started out as over 100 states was carved down to just 7, and so the interesting part now becomes, what do the kings of these remaining kingdoms do? For most, the answer was simple. Keep doing what they had already done, building stronger and stronger armies in hopes of holding on dearly onto what they have. However, one person dared to go far beyond that. A man by the name of Ying Zhen chose to do what was considered back then batshit insane: unify China. Drench the land into a sea of blood one last time in hopes of bringing together the Middle Kingdom and ending these 500 years of war, and so he would gather the greatest generals history has ever seen in an attempt to conquer the 6 most prolific nations to come out of the Warring States period. This was an endeavor so grand that it would echo throughout the next 2,000 years as one of the most ambitious the world has ever seen. And if you found any of that interesting, then boy do I have a series for you.
これが将軍の見る景色です。まったく困ったものですね。いつの時代も最強と称された武将たちはさらなる強者の出現で敗れます。まったくこれだから乱世は面白い。わらべしん、皆と共に修羅場をくぐりなさい。素質はありますよ。Shin.
For years, the story of the Warring States period was remembered only as a chaotic start to the China we know today, pushed into the background of history and overshadowed by more popular eras and stories like the Three Kingdoms, which had a much less messy history. And it remained that way for a long time until the year of 2006, when a man by the name of Yasuhisa Hara decided to tell that story through the perspective of Shin, a slave with the dream of becoming the greatest general in all of China, who along the way meets the Ying Zheng, known as Sei in Japanese. Gonna do that a lot, by the way. Translations with Chinese and Japanese names are really weird. Whom he helps during a rebellion, the two becoming close friends and setting out on this journey to unify China together. And trust me, it gets a lot more complicated than just that, but that is just the general plot. Here in the West, Kingdom is that series that you vaguely kind of know exists. It's always in the shadow of all the big seinen series you hear about, and that's for a lot of stupid reasons, which I'll get into later. And so what started out as me up at 3 AM unemployed and broke, looking for a manga to fill up the hole that these series left in me, turned into a fucking obsession, and one that has gotten so bad that I have spent the last few months researching everything I can about this series, from the very depths of ancient China to articles on why every 40-year-old businessman in Japan seems to think that Kingdom is the key to their success. And even though they are probably smoking some sort of unicorn crack, it is absurd how much that article made sense. And at the core of this acoustic obsession of mine is a how and a why, and why that how seemed to wanna fight each other. I don't know. But before I overwhelm you with this stupidly perplexing, complex idea of mine, let me first tell you a real story found in the records of the Grand Historian, and one that dates back hundreds of years before the birth of Ying Zheng to a man named Duke Mu of Qin. To keep it short, Duke Mu was a very important guy back when Qin was first building themselves up as a state. But you see, he was just as famous for this weird obsession he had. Horses. He loved his horses dearly, and he would pretty much collect them like Pokemon cards. However, one day, out of the blue, one of his favorite horses went missing. And so he sent his army to go look for it, only to find that it had been killed. And worse, it was being eaten by the tribe people living up on the mountains. Naturally, the men were fuming. They captured the tribe straight away and brought them back to be executed. But instead, Duke Mu did what every great leader does: say something weirdly cool. A gentleman does not allow his domestic animals to injure people. I have heard that if one eats good horse flesh but fails to drink wine, it will lead to illness, giving them food and wine before releasing them. Fast forward 3 years and Duke finds himself in a bit of a sticky situation. He's surrounded by a rival state's army with nowhere to run, and with his death all but guaranteed, the very tribe that he had pardoned came back to save him, repaying their debt by fighting to the death alongside the Qin army, even being able to capture one of their rulers, and so began the relationships between the nation of Qin and the tribespeople. Fun fact, Hara actually made a one-shot about that very story, but in this one, the Duke pardons the tribe people because the leader's really hot, which I find, objectively hilarious. All in all, it's a cute little story about how Duke Mu's compassion came full circle and ended up laying the groundwork for Qin's alliance with the mountain tribes, fighting side by side. However, the reality of what happened afterwards is far from cute. Despite the legend, the truth of the mountain tribes in Chinese history was brutal. After that brief moment of kindness, they still faced centuries of marginalization, being labeled as barbarians and pushed to the very edges of society. The Qin and later empires only valued them for battle, never granting them real respect or integration, and their loyalty was only ever met with suspicion and control. Duke Mu's kindness was sadly an exception, and they stayed trapped as outsiders for generations. This is where Kingdom comes in, because Hara channels those centuries of hatred that have been building up since Duke Mu's time to portray the mountain people as these terrifying beasts of war, blood-soaked savages who know nothing but violence and completely separated from Qin. And in the very opening arc of the series, Shin and Sei have to confront that hatred and violence to try and get back the throne from his brother's rebellion, having no army and therefore no other options but to ask for help. Even Yotanawa, also known as Yuang Zhuanhe, the king of the mountain tribes who's also a woman and has the same amount of aura as Michael Jackson in his prime, acknowledges the very nature of them. They will turn the palace into a sea of blood to take back his throne. But in the fucked up world that Kingdom is, it's the only choice they have. And so they descend upon the capitals like demons, leaping from building to building, scaling walls, and literally waving around boulders, smashing people bit by bit. And it's that savagery that makes it possible for an army of 3,000 to infiltrate the palace's 80,000 soldiers and somehow win. But it's through all this horror that a certain beauty shines in the mountain people. In that sea of blood, their pride, love, and unity to Yotanawa burn bright, proving that these so-called savages are in truth a smart, fearsome, and most of all, human force. And they show that same compassion and familiarity to Sei and the people of Qin. And in that very moment, we relive that same horse and liquor story from so many years ago, before they each return to their own wars, conquests, and bloodshed. And I think it's these two stories and how they intertwine between reality and fiction that summarizes where my obsession with this series comes from. What fascinates me the most about Kingdom is the way it holds two opposing truths about war. War in Hara's world is grotesque, limbs go flying, blood pours, men, women, and children scream and die in masses, and the mountain people embody this violence in its rawest form. And yet within that same violence, that same history, Hara is able to find something so deeply beautiful. So going back to my why and how, why depict a history marked by tyranny, violence, and unimaginable horrors in such a brutal and yet strangely romanticized light? And how do you even do that while still turning it into one of the most batshit insane depictions of war I've ever seen? Just to put it into perspective, the best comparison I can make with Kingdom is literally like mixing Baki and the Golden Age arc of Berserk and then injecting it with steroids. Because make no mistake, Kingdom isn't a story that is loosely based on history like many seinen we come across today, where they change entire events and characters to suit the story's needs. No, Hara aims to follow the records of the Grand Historian as it is, one of the most foundational historical texts in Chinese history, and the best and pretty much the only real account of the Warring States period that we actually have. Now don't worry, it's really vague to the point that it's kind of funny. Shin's father, Guso, was blind, and his mother having died, Guso married again, and had a son Jiang, who was arrogant. Guso loved his second wife, and frequently tried to kill Shin. I thought... But if something happens in it, it has or will happen in Kingdom. And I truly believe it's that dilemma, whether people realize it or not, that's led to millions upon millions of people being so invested in this series, and has what led to Kingdom being such a cultural phenomenon in just about everywhere outside of the West, becoming the 4th highest selling seinen manga of all time, 15th overall, having 6 seasons of an anime, 4 successful live action movies, which is pretty much unheard of, and it's even won the Guinness World Record for the manga written by the most people, with a total of 1,087 mangaka participating in that campaign to redraw the 26th volume of Kingdom. And I bring this up because that list includes Ichiro Oda, Masashi Kishimoto, Inoue, Araki, and so much more, which is fucking insane. And that is not even the tip of the iceberg in terms of just how popular Kingdom is outside of the West. So fuck you if you don't think it's a part of the seinen big 3. And it is my hope that by the end of this video, we can solve this dilemma together so I can finally get some sleep. Also, 2 things I want to quickly mention. 1, I made this video with both Kingdom fans and people who have never watched the series in mind, so don't be scared of me spoiling anything major without a huge unmissable fat warning sign. And 2, it's the thing that every video essayist does to survive, since YouTube pays jack shit: Patreon. If you enjoyed the video and you're interested in supporting the channel, please consider checking out the Patreon. Link is in the description. I also try my best to make it worth it. I'm posting the full director's cut of the video there and a fun little Kingdom discussion video. And also, if you like my editing, oh, thanks. I have some editing tutorials there, so feel free to check it out. But if you can't, don't worry, I love you regardless. And so with that out of the way, the question now becomes, what makes Kingdom's depiction of war batshit insane? You know how every battle shonen ends with this huge war arc where all the friends you made along the way join together to fight the big bad and his army? Well, imagine that, but instead of it being complete and how do I say this, dog shit, it's actually amazing. That is Kingdom. I have never seen war in any piece of media portrayed in such intricate detail as it is in this series. The number of moving parts in every battle was genuinely mind-boggling. The in-depth strategies, the soldiers themselves, their morale, the terrain, and even the basics like food, water, and so much more. It is like watching 5D chess unfold right in front of your eyes. And I think what makes that possible is that the characters in this series are genuinely geniuses. Some of the shit these guys come up with, I promise you, not even Einstein himself could think of. And that's mainly because every great general in Kingdom has their own distinct approach to warfare. For example, some characters like Osen, known as Wang Jian, are defensive geniuses. He sits back, preferring to rely on guaranteed wins and never overextending his army and keeping risk to a bare minimum, with a plan A, B, C, and Z always ready. Other generals like Ju, also known as Biao Gong, choose to rely on pure instinct. Having literally been born on the battlefield, he follows his feelings, tossing his army around until something sticks. Then there are people like Kanki, complete savages that don't give a damn how they do the job as long as it gets done, committing the most vile acts imaginable to secure his victory. Then there are brute force specialists like Mobu, all-around battlefield beasts like Rempart, and terrain-focused units like Yotanawa. These are just some of the examples of the many different ways the generals fight, all with layered tactics and overlapping styles. And what you end up with when they come together is the most galaxy brain moments you will ever get in manga, and that is a promise. But instead of me glazing non-stop, I think I should probably give an example of just how batshit crazy this can get. That being said, just a heads up, it's basically impossible for me to give an example of this without having some sort of spoilers. Kingdom is a really long series, and I really don't think knowing one example will take away from your overall experience, but if you want to go in completely blind, I understand, skip to here. During the Coalition Army arc, Shin is on the defensive, fighting off multiple invaders at a decisive battle at Konkoku Pass. In response, the generals and their army have been split into a clean offense and defense tactic, with Osen specifically tasked with defending the mountains from Yan's general, Ordo, and his army. A very important job, because if Ordo is somehow able to get past him, they go right behind Konkoku Pass, open the gates, allowing all the invaders inside and all but guaranteeing Shin's destruction. However, almost instantly things go wrong for Osen. Not only is Yan's army comprised of people from Yan's own mountain tribes, soldiers who literally specialize fighting in the mountains, but also their own general. Ordo is literally known as the king of 50 mountain tribes, a freak of nature who can read the mountains like a map, being able to pinpoint Osen's central fort's exact location and wipe it out with surgical precision. This quickly turned into a disaster, as the mountain could no longer serve as a natural protection for the fort, since, nobody fucking expected him to climb up it like Spider-Man, and so with no choice, Osen does what he always does when the odds are against him: withdraw, allowing Ordo to make his way through to the end of the mountains with only one more cliff to climb before being able to enter Shin's capital and wipe it out. And the reason I brought this up was to say that even in the most serious of circumstances, the characters stick to their characteristics. Osen knew how critical this was for the army. He knows that if he doesn't do his job, they're fucked. But he stuck to his tactics, and that's what makes the generals in Kingdom so special. In one of the most badass and low-key terrifying panels I've ever seen, Osen is staring at them climbing the cliff, literally looking down at Ordo's stupidity before attacking them from behind and almost wiping out their entire army. What's more, it turns out that he had never ran in the first place. The central fort was a red herring, and he had been waiting to ambush them at that spot from the very start. Ordo literally dancing in the palm of his hand the entire time. However, Ordo is able to escape by going backwards and taking up the fort that Osen had left behind, meaning that now Osen can't reach them because, they don't have Spider-Man to climb up the mountains. But Osen is still able to wipe out 8,000 of their mountain tribes, the very core of his army, before disappearing back into the mountains, Ordo once again losing sight of Osen. But you think it's over, right? You think it's over? It's not over. It's not fucking over. Osen placed a small portion of his army in the northwest, trying to bait Ordo into an obvious trap, but Ordo, fucking traumatized, refuses to take the bait because it's obvious that the rest of Osen's army are in the mountains waiting to ambush them. But you see, there's one little thing. Osen's army was never actually hiding in the first place. They had left to go help another Shin army as reinforcements in one of the most decisive moments in the entire arc, saving the country, and all because Osen predicted that Ordo wouldn't have taken the bait, because if he did, Shin would have been wiped out because there was literally nobody there to stop him. And I promise you, this is just one of the 50 twists and turns that happen in this batshit insane arc. Every battle in Kingdom is just this insane back and forth of of everything. This guy attacks here, but another guy predicted that, but this guy predicted that he would predict that, but this guy has a gut feeling that something's wrong, but this guy flips the whole fucking board, but this guy predicts that he's gonna flip the whole board, but this guy predicted that he was gonna flip the whole board, so the entire time he was preparing for it, but this guy has been preparing to flip the entire table that the board's on from the very start of the manga. And do you get what I'm saying, guys? 5D chess. I hope I made the point that this is what makes the battles in Kingdom never feel repetitive. You're bearing witness to tactical wit and genius so unrivaled that you as the reader simply cannot keep up with either of them. And all this makes it so that you never know how things are going to turn out until the very last second of the war. And it's because of that, like every Kingdom addict will tell you, the 800 chapters of the manga still feels so short. Every war takes around 50 to 100 chapters and you just fly through it because your heart is racing and itching to know what happens next. And yet, despite all that, it keeps a core simplicity, that war is both this horrifying thing and yet there's a certain romanticism to it. And that leads me very nicely to the most logical question that a person would have after seeing all this. How is this even possible? Wait, no, that's not specific enough. How smart do you have to be to write characters as fucking intelligent as this? Now, although Hara is a genius in my opinion, and we'll get more into that a bit later, a lot of his knowledge came from the historical strategies that took place in these periods, like the ones you can find in the Zhan Guoxi strategies of the Warring States and the famous Art of War by Sun Tzu. What I'm trying to say is the fact that it's based on real historical war strategies means so much to me because it adds a certain kind of truth to this series. What you're experiencing isn't completely fake, to a certain extent, of course. I don't think shit like this actually happened, but the bottom line is these are based on real generals that existed in history, and it kind of feels like this time machine taking you back. You're not just watching a fight, you're watching the kinds of decisions that people actually made, the kind of pressure they really lived under, and it goes even beyond just the Warring States period. Those stories you hear about the great generals and leaders throughout history become so much more significant. Alexander the Great, for example, after finally receiving some water in the brutal desert that his soldiers were marching through, decides to aura farm by pouring it on the floor in front of them, showing that he will not take what his men can't have, skyrocketing their morale and allowing them to get through the brutal desert. Or when Napoleon returned from exile and faced royalist troops sent to stop him, he approached them alone and said, "If you want to kill your emperor, here I am." And instead of shooting, the soldiers lowered their weapons and joined him, showing just how respected he was, taking back the throne that he crowned himself with. Or how Baldwin IV was literally dying and yet he would still go into battle, being carried by his soldiers and still somehow being able to win against the likes of Saladin himself. Or Khalid ibn Walid, someone I heard stories about a lot as a young Arab kid but never really thought much about, but now after reading Kingdom, him being so good at warfare that he would literally beg to die in battle as a martyr but never could because nobody could ever beat him is just so much more cool. What I'm trying to say is that Kingdom just puts it all into perspective and makes these legends feel so much realer than ever before. But that being said, it's so much more than just the strategies and the generals, it's how he physically portrays these wars. Hara draws hundreds of thousands of soldiers almost every chapter, and I feel like it's easy to forget as a Kingdom fan just how insane of a feat that is. Whenever I see another artist draw huge crowds of people, it's always used as the primary example of how great of an artist they are or just how much they've improved. One example I can think of is this panel by Isayama. It is amazing and I've seen so many people rightfully praise it, but once again it just puts into perspective how insane of a feat what Hara does is. And it's not just about the scale, the historical accuracy of the armor, the gear, the formation, the amount of detail is kind of just ridiculous. Going back to Osun for example, imagine how long it must take to draw his helmet. It might just be the most detailed thing I've ever seen, period. And just like the wars themselves, that hyper detail contrasts with Hara's simplistic character designs, and what this all does is it creates this constant feeling of chaos. As corny as it sounds, when Shin is fighting, it is almost like you are being overwhelmed alongside him and his army, and that's a good thing because it makes those moments of space that much more impactful. And make no mistake, when those moments come, Hara absolutely utilizes everything in his locker to make it something that you will not forget, because it is like everything, including time itself, just stops. And that brings us nicely into my second point on the art. The greatness of generals isn't just about a title given to them or people in the story hyping them up. No, it's actually about feeling their might through the art. Quite literally, by the way, they are fucking huge. Hara does this thing where he doesn't draw size based on how tall or big they actually are, but pretty much just based on their aura. And I think this is where that Baki-esque feeling I spoke about earlier comes from. A character is bigger based on how overwhelming or impactful their presence is. I actually have a funny headcanon that most of these guys are tiny and not this fucking scary in real life. And let me tell you, I love that because it makes every fight with Shin feel like this insane Souls boss fight, and in general, just this mountain you have to overcome. Just look at this hit that he takes from Renpa, also known as Lian Po. You feel your bones shake alongside him. But on the opposite end, when two great generals do come up against each other, it is always this raw physical spectacle. That being said, there's one very specific thing that I'm obsessed with, and it's a thing that I don't really see anybody mention. The swings from the generals has this insane amount of weight and destruction about it that no anime or live action adaptation can really capture. But it's different to a series like Berserk where Guts shows the weight of his sword by smashing through everything in its path. These are clean slices, and what this does is it adds this element of skill and just experience to it. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm gonna do this one last fucking time, but there's this little thing that Hara does with the weapons that I'm like clinically obsessed with. They bend. The weapons fucking bend. I have never seen this before anywhere. And why is that so interesting? Well, because I don't think this is meant to be physically possible. Gonna get a bit nerdy here. During the Warring States period, weapons were either made of bronze or towards the end iron. If you're a general, it is more likely that you had a bronze weapon since it's more valuable. So for it to bend logically is just stupid because bronze just doesn't do that. And yet it might just be the coolest shit I've ever seen because it just sends vibrations down your body and gives me goosebumps every time. God. Okay, so after glazing this series non-stop for the last 10 minutes about why it's just so enthralling, the question you probably have, whether you've read this series or not, is why doesn't anybody read this manga? And that brings me onto a fun little section called Why You Can't Recommend Kingdom to Anybody.
Brought to you by Uncle Has.
There are a lot of reasons as to why Kingdom hasn't been a success in the West like Berserk, Vagabond, or Vinland, even though better. But it mainly comes down to two reasons. For almost 20 years, Kingdom has never gotten an official English release, meaning that unless you're a little criminal like me, the only way to read it is through unofficial scans and translations. But probably even more than that is the fucking bizarre anime situation. I don't know what kind of crack people were smoking in 2010, but for some reason, one dumbass thought it was a good idea to make the first 2 seasons CGI. And this isn't even the good CGI we're getting, because Kingdom by Studio Orange would be fucking amazing. Just look at this. But the really weird part for me is that after the first 2 seasons, one of the higher-ups was like, guys, clearly this isn't fucking working. You think? And it's genuinely a really good anime adaptation. Now, it isn't the Sakuga fuckfest that every fan expects these days, but genuinely it's a really solid anime adaptation. The character designs, I argue, might even be better than the manga. The soundtrack, as you've already heard in the intro, is fucking phenomenal, made by Sawano and Yota, known for arguably the best soundtrack of all time, Attack on Titan, and it doesn't skip any content. But it sucks so much because you can't recommend the anime to anybody, because nobody is willing to sit through 2 seasons of dog shit, and if you decide to read the manga, at that point you might as well just stick to it. But good news, we're finally getting an English adaptation that will fix 90% of its problems, like how they keep fucking switching between Japanese and Chinese names that don't sound anything alike. And call me crazy, but in the same way One Piece was this huge success in Japan but not in the West for a long time until it finally broke through a couple of years ago, I think the future is looking bright for us Kingdom fans. That being said, I brought up these 2 things, the strategy and the art, to make 2 points here. 1, when you combine these 2 things, it is a breathtaking experience that purely based on entertainment alone is worth reading. And 2, that this is a seinen manga through and through. This is a brutal, unforgiving, honest, fucked up world where people put the head of generals on a stick to show power, and women and children are either left alive to live under a new rule or slaughtered and violated based on which generals conquer their land. But it is precisely that which makes our protagonist Shin one of the most interesting characters / concepts I've seen in a very long time. Shin is one of the more underrated characters, not just in Kingdom, but just in the seinen demographic as a whole. And I mean, I get it. His counterparts are literally the likes of Masashi, Mori, Thorfinn, Guts, and a lot of other bizarre-ass characters. And in this insane world of the Warring States period, Shin just feels like your typical shonen protagonist, a naive, hot-headed peasant with this insane, out-of-this-world dream to be the greatest general under the heavens. Kingdom is a story that, like I've said, is dealing with a million different moral, political, and historical dilemmas. And the reason it's so long is because there's so much to cover. Shin and his idealistic dream can sometimes feel like a child playing in the background of these more serious and real issues. However, I think that's the very beauty of it. It's that vivid contradiction between his dream and what it actually entails. He will empathize with you, respect you, and yet still cut down thousands of men to reach you and take your head off, because he understands that at its core, that is what a general is. The generals in Kingdom are far from good people, whether it's the ones he looks up to or the ones he faces. But it's exactly because they romanticize the idea and truly believe in it that you can't help but respect them, no matter who you are. Because yes, you are allowed to deceive, lie, blackmail, and do whatever it takes to win, but that is not something people can romanticize, and therefore you are not a great general to others. That being said, those who are considered great generals are vastly different from one another. A war-hating strategist like Riboku, also known as Li Mu, or an honor-chasing brute like Renpar, but regardless, all these people are connected by one thing: the recognition of others. Because at the end of the day, they are men who have dedicated their entire being to war. And you can see that in Yasuhisa Hara's words when defining what a great general is. A great general is someone whose presence can move an entire nation. And what separates a great general to a great general under the heavens? Well, that's simple. Luck. The title Great General of the Heavens speaks to a person's fortune when standing against overwhelming odds. It's not just about sheer skill, it's also about having the rare luck to be in the right place at the right time when the situation seems impossible. And no other character embodies that more than Oki, also known as Wang Chi, who, trust me, I know this man looks horrifying, but he is probably the most important character in the story thematically outside of Sei, because he is the last remaining of the 6 great generals of Shin from their previous golden age, and a symbol of everything a great general of the heavens should be. That's why Shin's dream matters so much. It's not just about strength, but being worthy of the role. In most stories, growth is measured by strength, but in Kingdom, it is represented by how many soldiers you have under your command. And that's probably why this article about why 40-year-old businessmen think that Kingdom is the key to their success makes so much sense. Because a big part of Kingdom is about earning people's loyalty, building teams and leading others towards a shared vision. And that's why I feel like even if you don't enjoy seeing people's heads get cut off, there is a lot you can take out of Kingdom and apply to your everyday life. By the way, my favorite part is when they compare Elon Musk to Kanki. And if you've read Kingdom, you know that's a very insane comparison, but also respect Kanki. And yet, Shin's vision goes even further than Oki's. He doesn't just aim to achieve what's never been done before, to earn the recognition of all of China, but also to become a man of honor and justice, someone who helps others and does what's right, even in a world where that ideal seems impossible. Where conquest means crushing others, he still tries. Shin is truly a shonen character in a seinen story, a character trying to give life to a dream that does not exist. He has to kill people he empathizes for, work alongside the most vile figures imaginable, and confront the very nature of what unifying China actually means. That being said, for as nice as the idea is, it doesn't answer the specific question I'm trying to figure out. There are numerous eras of bloodshed and violence throughout history that he could have done this with. Why choose these people, this specific history, to depict such a story? And that brings me on to something I haven't really mentioned in this video, and honestly kind of been hiding: the real historical figures behind these characters and what actually happened to them. As I've mentioned before, Kingdom follows the records of the Grand Historian, and while there is a lot of creative wiggle room, and I'll get more into that in a bit, the core historical events are generally respected. If a major event happens in the historical records, like an army losing a battle or a key figure dying, Hara will incorporate that into the story, and because of this, a lot of people choose not to look at the actual history to avoid spoilers, and that's completely fair. But before I give you a historical spoiler warning, I don't know why that sounds really funny, I want to talk about why I think you should know at least some of the history of it for the best, most unique Kingdom experience you can have, even if just vaguely, so stay with me. Most stories you come across have a feeling of anticipation that builds up as you get through it because you don't know what's going to happen next. However, Kingdom does that thing where in the literal opening pages it tells you that Shin will become a great general of the heavens by showing you a glimpse of him in the future. And what this does is it gives you a cushion where you're like, oh, even if this happens or this person dies, etc., Shin and Sei will end up achieving their dream, which overall lowers the anticipation and tension of what's going to happen next to them. Once again, the insanity of the twists and turns in the wars more than makes up for that, but it is still something to take into account. However, knowing the historical context does the complete opposite. It makes you turn every page in fear because it is heartbreakingly brutal. The records of the Grand Historian were created during the Han Dynasty after the Warring States period, and by people who famously had agendas and spite towards the Qin Dynasty, even going as far as to burn almost all the historical records from the Warring States era. And that meant two things: they're not historically accurate, and more importantly than that, they're vague. So vague that, like I said earlier, it simply lists the events and who was there, and if you're lucky, maybe a vague description of their personalities. And what this does is it gives Hara a lot of creative liberties. One example being that Kyokai was probably a man in history, however since the Shiji records does not explicitly mention the gender, Hara is able to go in a more interesting direction. Or one of the biggest being that the person that MC was based on, Shin, was not actually a slave. As a matter of fact, he was from a noble family. Regardless, what this all means is that the tension and anticipation you have whilst reading is in how Hara will depict these events. Will he display it as it's shown in the Shiji records, or will he show another angle, another side that puts that event in a completely different light? But it's because of all this, knowing historically what happens to all these characters makes that tension and anticipation so much more intense and throws that cushion you get at the start into the bin. It won't be specific, but nonetheless, historical spoilers ahead. Skip to here if you don't want to know what Sei and Shin were actually known for historically. So far, I've made Kingdom out to be this grand epic, which it is, but for the real Li Shin, it is anything but that. Historically, Li Shin was depicted as a young noble that earned his way up the ranks by being there for most of the battles during Qin's conquest. However, he is known most for having one of the biggest blunders during Ying Zheng's reign. It is a blunder so big that to this day, he is used as the exemplar of why you should never be overconfident. And I've seen so many people even being baffled at how he didn't get his head cut off for it. And after that specific blunder, he would spend the rest of the conquest in the background of the other generals and retire having his legacy tainted by that one failure. Sei, on the other hand, is a lot more famous. He is depicted by many historians as a tyrant so greedy that he tried to transcend the very cycle of life and death, only to be killed by that very ambition, most likely dying due to mercury poisoning, something that people believed back then could give you immortality. Worse, the people under his rule despised him for his harsh, authoritarian approach, where he would have people executed for simply knowing a criminal. And because of that, the Qin dynasty, although did lay the foundation for the future of China, was to many a failure, only lasting a mere 15 years before being destroyed from the rebellions after Sei's death. And so yes, I get that Hara might have initially been drawn to the idea of the first person to unify China as an appealing premise, but it goes deeper than that. He said himself that he studied the Shiji records in depth long before he ever created Kingdom, so the brutal reality surrounding these characters, the tragedies, betrayals, and harsh outcomes is something that he has already taken into account. This entire story is written with that historical awareness in mind. Why? Why choose these figures? Real people whose lives are marked by such terrible ends. Why build them up, make us love them, root for them, only for history to doom them? Because when you know that truth, there's this constant anxiety of what if Hara truly depicts things like this, Shin's tragic ending, Sei's descent into evil, and there becomes this constant melancholy surrounding this story. And I'm gonna be completely honest, this sadness remained for a while until I started reading up on some interviews and came across one quote from Hara about a debate that takes place in the manga between Ryofu and Sei on what the essence of humanity is. And it's here where I think that I understood why Hara chose this specific time period, finally bringing all my fucking questioning to an end. This debate takes place at the climax of the battle for the throne, and it comes down to a battle of ideals, Ryofu's view on how to deal with the current state of humanity or Sei's. Ryofu, aka Lu Boy, has lived his entire life as a merchant, and through that has experienced all kinds of people coming face to face with almost every human desire. So at this point he argues that the essence of humanity is money, or more specifically the monetary system itself. He argues that this is humanity's greatest invention, as it has given us a way to measure wealth and therefore create a power that exists outside of physical violence, and he will use that power to deal with the other states. And when it comes down to his view on war, he believes that human conflict will never end. In his time selling arms weapons, he's seen numerous reasons as to why people fight, and yet not a single one of them is wrong, because to him it is simply a part of human nature. To quote, "I have already told you, have I not? To make war is an expression of human nature. It is without a doubt a hallmark of human society. To reject that is to reject being human itself. If you cannot accept this reality in your efforts to rule, then the world will never be able to make any progress." And Hara even goes on to say that looking at the state of the world now, it turns out that Ryofu wasn't wrong in the slightest. Considering the current state of the world today, it seems like Lu Boy was more right than Ying Zheng, who was trying to attack and destroy other countries, especially considering that countries have been exhausted by 500 years of war. You may think that it would have been better to make Lu Boy's theory on the state something that the protagonist's side could easily win, but that's no good. Considering Lu Boy's background and personality, I thought that he would speak the truth confidently in this scene. Even I, the author, cannot twist it. But before I talk about how Sei argues against that unshakable truth that still exists even today, I want to talk about one major difference between him and his historical counterpart. The actual Ying Zheng was born in Qin's rival state Zhao, whilst his father, the Prince of Qin, was held as a hostage there, a common practice back then. And because of that, he still grew up in a luxurious lifestyle, however it was still probably an extremely hostile environment with his life constantly in danger. It was only when he was 9 that with the help of the real Ryofu, he was returned to Qin where he eventually became king. However, Yasuhisa Hara takes that story to the absolute extreme. In Kingdom, Ryofu did actually help the prince escape back to Qin so he could eventually become king and set Ryofu up as the chancellor. But when he escaped back to Qin, Sei and his mother were left behind in Zhao. Furthermore, he was forced to grow up as a peasant where he would still to survive because the Zhao government stopped caring about him and providing them support. and it was horrific. The citizens would abuse him constantly due to their hatred of Shin, probably having lost their family or friends to them in the war, where they would beat and humiliate him constantly, even pissing on him afterwards, which is fucked up to say the least. And it doesn't end there. His mother couldn't get a job, even though she was a Zhao citizen, for the crime of birthing Shin royalty, and so she was forced to make ends meet by selling her body. She would come home and take out all her anger on Sei, beating him constantly, and the abuse got so bad that he completely lost all his senses, unable to feel anything anymore, literally becoming a husk of a human being. And you can simply see this all on his face, filled with what I can only describe as utter disgust towards humanity. And it remained that way for a long time until he came across a merchant woman named Shika, who was tasked with helping him escape from Zhao to Shin, where he would become king. And she was the only person in all his time alive who showed him any kindness, and it was a kindness so immense that it gave him his humanity back, finally being able to feel again. All it took was a person willing to give up everything to save him, the first time in his world of darkness that he saw something else. And so the response he gives to Ryofu is that the essence of humanity is light. The time I spent together with her numbered only a few days, but it was within her that I first witnessed the compassion and strength a person is capable of, as well as a powerful light. He believes that we're all born with that same inner light, but when we're cast into the deepest parts of the abyss, that light can fade, giving rise to the darker side of humanity, the side that seeks war, and it is war above all else that extinguishes that light, trapping us in an endless cycle of pain and despair. Yet on the other side, those who pass on often do so burning with that same fierce light, and it gets carried forward by the next person and the one after, just like Shika did for Sei, and just like Hyo did for Shin at the very beginning, sparking a light that only grows brighter with time. When that light goes out, we fall into tragedy, and there is no greater cause of that tragedy than war. So whether he becomes a tyrant or a hero, he will end war so that the next generation can carry an even brighter light. And it's here where even Ryofu is brought to tears. What I'm trying to say is that I think I'm finally starting to understand why Hara chose this specific time period. Most famous historical figures and time periods have extensive records of writing that reflect their personality and intentions, many even directly writing about themselves, so we can get a sense of who they are just through their own words. But the Warring States period is different. It is a time filled with uncertainty and despair, where records are sparse and biased, and someone like Ying Zheng, later known as Qin Shi Huang, is viewed in drastically different ways. To some a tyrant, to others a hero, and ultimately his legacy is paradoxical, harsh and oppressive, yet foundational to the China we know today. And Li Shin, often remembered in history for his failure, becomes Hara's way of looking at something deeper. Hara isn't just telling an entertaining story, he's using these harsh truths and controversial characters to reframe how we see them, to bring humanity to the names that history flattened or vilified. So it's not just that these people existed, it's how they existed. It's about recognizing the human experience behind history, and maybe even reshaping how we remember them. And I promise you, there is no better example of that than the Battle of Sei. That being said, we are treading on very heavy spoiler territory here. However, I'm going to be honest with you, I made this entire video around this one moment, so I just had to bring it up. If you haven't read the series, what I suggest is skipping to this timestamp and then coming back to this section after you've read the series, because trust me, it is not something you want to miss. In the climax of the Coalition arc, after failing to get through Kankoku Pass, Riboku, aka Li Mu, Shin's greatest adversary, forces his way through the southern path, conquering city after city until he reaches the final destination he has to conquer before he gets into Shin and wipes out everything, the city of Sai. At this point in the arc, the entire Shin army is already being held up fighting all of the other invading forces, meaning that the city of Sei is all but defenseless, with only the small Haishin unit that's already on the brink of despair having taken a massive loss to Hoken and Riboku. Sei, realizing that he's out of options, makes the decision to go and fight in the city of Sai himself in an attempt to turn the entire population, made up of mostly elderly men, women and children, into an army to fend off Riboku's forces. And even then, it would only just about match the number of battle-hardened soldiers under Riboku, making this pretty much a hopeless endeavor. But Sei, desperately clinging onto his dream, still tries. But then, something that I didn't expect happens. When Sei appears in front of the citizens, they are frozen in shock. I feel like until this point, I never realized, or it just wasn't made clear, how big of a deal the king was back then to just normal everyday people. This was back when a king was seen as divine. People would go their entire lives without ever catching a glimpse of royalty, so for him to appear in front of them is kind of insane. However, it's not just that. Sei gives a speech asking them to protect their kingdom, explaining that it is up to them, the people, to save their nation, and more than that, believe in the light that each of them has inside of them. And so the citizens have tears coming down their face when seeing Sei, and at his request, abandon their plans to surrender and choose to fight. As I've already said, everything plays a role in the battles that occur in Kingdom, but one of the most important is morale. How dedicated are your soldiers? And so just to put it into perspective, if the morale instilled by a great general like Oki is, let's say, 100, then the morale of having the king fight alongside you is, let's say 100,000, and I am not over-exaggerating. The impact he has on the citizens is so insane that it leaves Riboku baffled as to how they can put up a fight alongside Shin and the others for days and nights. And yes, days and nights. Back then, almost like it was etiquette, armies would choose not to fight at night because, you know, they don't have street lamps and fighting in the dark is kind of fucking insane. But the son of a bitch Riboku split his army to capitalize on their inexperience, forcing them to defend the city on both ends night and day to try and wear them out. However, every time their body starts to give out from the sleep deprivation, one look at Sei is all it takes for them to literally come back from the dead. And I can't see anything I've ever experienced showcasing the core of humanity and what we're able to do when we come together and believe in the same thing. But this is Kingdom, a realistic, most of the time, war manga, and so on the 7th day, they finally hit their limit after losing more than half their citizens, and Riboku's army finally breaks through, and it leaves them in tears, thinking that all they've done was for nothing, but more than anything, how they let down their king. Until, at the very last moment, the tribesmen from the very start of the manga come back to aid Sei, Shin, and save the kingdom of Chin. Sei was just half a step ahead of Riboku, hiding that information about the rebellion earlier on in the manga, catching him by surprise and saving Chin. This moment summarizes everything about Kingdom that I love, the insane high IQ strategies, the aura, the fights, the hype, but more than anything, the essence of humanity and how we're all connected. How it's in the most horrific of times that we find things that are the most beautiful. A history that was simply described as one of the most violent periods in human history has now turned into a tale about just what we humans can do together, even in the darkest of moments. How every single experience and connection you make, good or bad, has an effect on who you are and the path you walk, whether it be in your lifetime or the next. So be willing to connect with others just like Jutmu did all those years ago and the kingdom of Chin under Sei. Just be willing to carry the light of others, and that is a complex and simple and batshit insane kind of beauty that only a manga like Kingdom could bring out. Hi, going a bit off script here. For the majority of the very long amount of time it took me to make this video, I was like, this is it. I've said everything I wanted to say about this series. If you haven't read it, you should, and if you have, well, read it again. It's just that fucking amazing! But more than anything, I felt like I had solved my personal dilemma with this series. I understood why Hara chose this time period, these people, and I felt at peace. Well, I lied, I wasn't at peace, because the entire time there was just something in the back of my mind that was nagging at me, telling me, no Haas, you have to talk about this one more thing that you've been really obsessed with and you can't stop thinking about. And I feel like what I'm going to say is a bit corny, but another reason I decided to keep it in the end was because I feel like now more than ever we need it. We are so divided, so dehumanized and alienated from one another that I feel like this one more thing that I'm going to talk about, you know, this is very vague and abstract, but you will understand by the end hopefully, is something we need now more than ever, and I feel like it's something that Kingdom speaks to. So, yeah. As I've already said in this video, after the Qin dynasty fell, the Han dynasty had no interest in preserving its legacy in good faith. Instead, they actively worked to tarnish nearly all historical accounts of that era, especially those concerning Qin Shi Huang. And through state-sponsored histories like the Records of the Grand Historian, they rewrote the narrative, casting the Qin as a cautionary tale, and in doing so, the Han didn't just bury Qin's artifacts, they buried an entire perspective of history, replacing it with one that served their own political ideals. And so for almost 2,000 years, the only thing we've ever known about that era was the one fed to us through the Han's legacy, some even wondering if it ever really existed, until in 1974 farmers were digging in a well when they stumbled upon fragments of clay figures. Little did they know it would turn out to be arguably one of the biggest archaeological findings of the 20th century. Thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, horses, chariots and weapons created over 2,000 years ago to guard the tomb of Qin Shi Huang. What's even more insane is that each soldier is unique, with different facial features, hairstyles and armor, believed to represent the various ranks and regions of the Qin's royal army. And it was built because of Qin Shi Huang's eventual acceptance of his mortality and wanting his people to protect him in the afterlife. Like many ancient rulers, he believed that life continued after death and that he would need an army to defend and serve him beyond the grave. And I'm gonna be honest, something about this makes me really emotional, especially when it's referenced in the season 3 ending with that beautiful beautiful music. It is undeniable proof that these were real people that existed, and that's clearly something that's very important to Hara. One of my favorite things I came across when looking at all his interviews was how he was so invested in this one little letter a soldier sent to his mother asking her to send some clothes. Like, that is so fucking cool, man. I don't know if that's just me, that the people back then were really alive and still live on in some sense through stories like Kingdom. The same immortality that Qin Shi Huang tried so hard to obtain is in some way still here. That history is everlasting through so many things, the very nation of China that millions of people live in, to comics like Kingdom, but more than any of that, it's thinking of it alongside Shin's speech. In one of the more recent chapters, Shin is asked what he thinks the nature of man is, the same way Sei was by Ryofu, and his answer was a little different. Not light, but fire. The fire of life and the fire of will. It's a more ferocious answer, and one that acknowledges the very fragile nature of what we think is good and evil. Everybody has their own fire and their own way of life, but in an environment like war, for as horrible as it is the only place where everybody's fire gets released, and sometimes the fire of life will go out. But as Shin says, the fire of will gets carried on and inherited by another, whether they be your friend or foe, for they are all people that define us. And that fire will get bigger and bigger as the world goes on. But what is this will Shin keeps talking about? Well, I think it's our everlasting will to exist. And things like the terracotta army, Kingdom, China, and the very humans that are alive today, me and you, no matter what, this is proof that the fire carries over from human to human. And in the context of Qin, even after the Han Dynasty spent so much trying to destroy its remains, 2,000 years later, there is still proof that they existed. And it's here where I think we can find what the essence of Kingdom is and what it says about us. We are simply people that lived in the 21st century, and we are connected because we will be remembered that way by the people that come after us. And just like the characters in Kingdom, whether they were enemies or friends, good or evil, they were simply people that lived in the same period, the Warring States period. As usual, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. It means the world to me. I don't know if you can tell, I love Kingdom and really hope this video helps show just how amazing it is. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. And hey, if you want to go one step further, the link to my Patreon is in the description. Outside of the editing stuff that's on there, the director's cut of the video includes 10 extra minutes of me talking about Kanki, Raboku, and Kyokai. And the hour-long Kingdom discussion video will be me talking about my personal character rankings, which is probably very controversial, theories, and stuff of that sort, so don't miss out. Again, link in the description. And once more, I hope you live a long, happy life, my friend.